Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. You're listening to the longest running superhero role-playing game on Earth. I'm the Game Master, your host, and today we're going to be talking about Fembots, which really blew up in the 1960s. When I first saw the Fembots in the Austin Powers movies, I didn't realize, I guess, why they were there. And it turns out that the Fembot thing was kind of everywhere in the 60s. It was very, very popular. But at any rate, before we get into that, friendly reminder, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, or make sure you're still subscribed because we did lose some subscribers relatively recently. And that's something YouTube does without telling you sometimes. So double check that. Ring the bell so you know when I upload more stuff. And as always, leave a comment because that really helps us out with the YouTube algorithm. What I want on my end is just to share the story with as many people as possible. And so when you leave a comment, that helps us do that. So thank you, everybody, for doing all that stuff. Thank you for being here. I genuinely, sincerely appreciate you guys. And we really do have a great community here, and it's all because of you. Thank you. Okay. So as you can probably already tell, I'm going to do this one more freeform, rather than like following a script. So I'm gonna try to remember everything and not leave anything out. This is going to kind of be an overview of several games that we ran, which were based on several franchises that were doing things in the 1960s. So first up is A for Andromeda. We ran an A for Andromeda game, which most people have never heard of this franchise. Um, in our version, the idea is that on October 3rd of 1961, there's this signal received from outer space. And this kind of confuses people in a way. Basically, it's two sets of blueprints. One of them is for this supercomputer, this alien supercomputer, right? But the deal is it's ridiculously user unfriendly because it was designed for aliens to use it. And so, like, nobody on Earth has like the appropriate skill that would actually let them use this thing. So that's where the second set of schematics comes in, and that is to build um this female robot, right? Or a fembot for short. And this is kind of what kicks all this off. And she, as is so often the case in all of these stories, she's very much kind of like a life-size Barbie doll, where she first of all can completely pass as a human. We see stuff like she can kiss a man and he doesn't notice anything, so it's not like the inside of her mouth is full of wires and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Um, but she completely can pass as human. Um, in terms of her appearance, she's got blonde hair and blue eyes. Um, And at any rate, her whole thing is she's the only one that really knows how to work the supercomputer. So that said, nobody really knows, nobody can get into the computer and like go through the coding or something to figure out what its agenda is or whatever, right? That's the setup in this the original TV show A for Andromeda. It was kind of like the precursor to Doctor Who. Even some of the stuff with the fembots gets sort of recycled in later Doctor Who stuff, like in the 70s. But it was an old black and white TV show. And so the idea is that there is this guy named John Fleming, and his job is sort of like, there's like the first layers, there's the computer itself, right? That nobody knows how to use except for the robot girl, whose name is Andromeda. Then the next layer is kind of like John Fleming is the guy who works for the British government, whose job is to sort of like he's the girl's handler. And I rewatched the show to sort of jog my memory. And by today's standards, excuse me, it's very shocking how insanely like sexist and stuff this guy is. Like, everything that comes out of his mouth is just abuse. And, like, at one point, he's telling this girl, it almost seems like, you ever see these shows where it's often some kind of a period piece and they lay on the sexism, like, so strong, you kinda roll your eyes and you're like, "Yeah, I don't think anybody in real life would ever actually say that," you know? This guy does. Like, and they're not even trying to make him be sexist or anything. I think that was just kind of like how things were back then. But at any rate, it's sort of a tangent I'm on, but, like, every single thing that comes out of this guy's mouth is like, "You'd look nicer if you wore your hair this way," or, "Maybe you should wear a dress that's a little more revealing," or whatever, you know? He's, like, telling her to wear perfume, and I'm not so sure she has a sense of smell. It's kind of unclear, but she's well, he says whatever the thing, maybe it was the perfume thing, he's like, "That would be nice." And so she kinda says, like, "I don't know the difference between, like basically good and bad," right? Because she's newly built, she's just starting out in life, she knows, like, nothing yet. So he decides to hurt her, and she can feel pain, and then he's like, "So take a guess, which one do you think that was? Like, was that naughty or nice?" And she's like, "Naughty." And he's like, "Hey, yeah, you're right. Now you know the difference." So I'm watching this and I'm just like, "Man, what a jerk." But anyway, so that's the whole thing going on there, right? Well, so then in our game, because our assumption we made in the show, England seems to be the only country in the world that received the signal and built the computer or built the Fembot, right? So in our game, we make the assumption that all of the major countries of the world, if they had the technology to receive the signal, and if they had the resources to actually build the computer that is in the instructions, that they would. And so we get into the idea that Russia, the USSR, they build a supercomputer, and then they also build a fembot named Mashina. And so they ask Mashina to have their computer design basically bigger, better nukes. And it does. And so the deal here is that they're faster than the conventional kind and so on and so forth. And and then we sort of go back to what we actually saw on the show, which is that for some reason, there are very fast nuclear missiles being fired over London. And they're tracking them on radar and stuff, and they're so fast they can't shoot them down, and so on and so forth. And so, therefore, the the royal family of England, which in our game, by the way, friendly reminder, we had an earlier adventure where the British royal family had been replaced. It was a body snatcher story with the White Martians, and so there's a hero in our game named King Arthur. He got rid of them, you know, and he was the actual King Arthur way back when. So he actually has a legit claim to the throne, and we thought that was kind of cool for the once and future king thing. So by 1961, the King of England is King Arthur, right? And the Queen is Morgan Le Fay, who, another friendly reminder in our game, she was heroic and Merlin was the bad one, and we treated it as the victor writes history kind of thing. And Merlin kind of won back in the Middle Ages when all the dust had settled. At any rate, so it's actually Arthur and Morgan Le Fay who are kind of giving the order for Andromeda to ask this computer to build something that can shoot this thing down. So we're getting kind of this idea of the Cold War arms race stuff is like escalating quickly, right? The tech level is making these big jumps because of these computers. So now Britain has the fastest missiles, and then they shoot down the other missiles. You know what I mean? And during this whole process, by the way, um, something interesting happens on this show, A is for Andromeda, which is because the robot girl is like naive or whatever you want to call her. You know, she's still super young. We don't really have a clear idea, I don't think, of how old she is at this point. Maybe she's weeks old, something like that. But the point is, like, I'm going to put this in GURPS terminology for a minute. She has no like manipulation skill or anything. You know what I mean? She doesn't know how to deceive people yet, or you know, she can't be passive aggressive or anything like that. She's she's very blunt and she's very open to the point of it working against her own mission. So she just says that it's good that she's like becoming indispensable and gaining higher levels of security clearance. And so, of course, to everybody around her, this is a huge red flag. So they question her, and she gives away that the whole plot here, the aliens that sent the signal, they want more control over Earth's defenses because they want to come in and take over, right? So at any rate, the British supercomputer electrocutes Andromeda for the disobedience or whatever, for giving away too much information to the humans. So the organic people around her, of course, they have blueprints to build Andromedas kind of willy-nilly, right? So they just build another Andromeda. And this one knows that the previous one was punished for not doing as the computer said, basically, right? Like the computer is really Andromeda's master. Um, and so what that is setting up is that, you know, the pretty girl robot wants to be good, but kind of can't be good as long as the computer's around. So predictably, the computer is then destroyed, right? And kind of once you cut the puppet strings, in this case, she develops free will, she becomes more like a human being, you know, so on and so forth. So we can actually see that the fembots can evolve and that sort of thing, right? Kind of like Data from Star Trek The Next Generation, where that was sort of his long-term goal. We just see it happen pretty fast, actually, in this case. Well, so then the thing we do in the game that had no parallel on the show is, so we have Andromeda and King Arthur go to, well, by the way, he fires Fleming because he uh learns from Andromeda all this crap that Fleming keeps pulling with her, right? Where he's like physically hurting her, he's just constantly sexually harassing her, so on and so forth. Arthur's not having it, so they get rid of Fleming, who ironically on the TV show was kind of the central human protagonist. At any rate, Arthur and Andromeda go to the United Nations and they are warning people what's really going on with these computers. And so what we get then is, I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who is the UN guy for America. Adlai Stevenson, I think it is, in that year, is the current US representative to the UN. He's being kind of a prick. His thing is he's kind of like, we don't want to get rid of our computer because we got to compete with Russia. And like, as long as Russia has the computer, they're going to have like bigger, better nukes. So we need our computer to give us bigger, better nukes. And Arthur is kind of like, yeah, but that's is all part of this big, you know, aliens are going to take over the world, right? Or they're going to manipulate things in such a way, because unlike the fembots, the aliens are very manipulative. The aliens are going to manipulate stuff in such a way that there are no humans when they arrive, right? And for all we know, they're just immune to radiation and are fine with, you know, global levels of destruction. So this gets back to JFK, who destroys the American computer. And by the way, then we meet the American fembot, whose name is Eve. And she actually becomes a really, really major character in our game in the 90s. And I'll get more into that later, but this is kind of the big reason for me to even make this video, is to introduce Eve. So Eve, just like Andromeda in, they're both blondes. They don't look like the exact same woman, which is kind of slight differences in how they're constructed. Each one, if we were going to make a live action movie, each one would be played by a different actress, but it's always kind of the same idea of, try to cast somebody that you think would make a good Barbie, for instance, right? At any rate, so Eve also, becomes self-aware, she becomes a hero, so on and so forth, right? But then back in Russia, um, they don't want to destroy their computer, right? And they're sort of like, look at these fools who, without their stuff, we're going to have the superiority. We're going to be able to do whatever we want with our missiles, blah blah blah. And so one of the characters that learns about this is Black Widow, because in 1961 there are actually a lot of Russian supers in our game. So like one of them is Dr. Tunguska, who, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Tunguska blast. You should look it up. In our game, when the Tunguska blast happened, um, there was one survivor, and it was Dr. Tunguska. And we literally just used the stats of Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen. And so her thing is sort of like, just by virtue, because she's older than the USSR, right? Um, and so when they took over, they just kind of tell her she has to work for them. So she feels like she has to, but she's not in love with the job. You know what I mean? So she's around, and then another Russian superhero at this point in our timeline is Mother Russia, who's another original character I created. I don't know how familiar you are with a Golden Age character named Uncle Sam from DC. Uncle Sam is a really interesting character, actually, because he is the embodiment of all of America, right? And so with Mother Russia, for instance, one of the things we said was, if you took the stats of every Russian and if you said, okay, how much can each one of them lift? Like, write down all those numbers and then add them together, the sum of all that is how much Mother Russia can lift. That's her strength. And then likewise, if you take the mind attribute, which is kind of like how much mental damage can you take before you're knocked out, you add all of that together for all of the Russians, and that's her mind, right? And so she's this insanely powerful character. And so she is sort of like the living embodiment of the Soviet Union. So unlike Dr. Tunguska, who, she predates the Soviet Union, she actually longs for more of the stuff we saw in like the Anastasia movie, the old Russia, you know what I mean? Um, that's not at all how Mother Russia is, right? Despite her name, she doesn't like represent all of Russian history or anything like that. She's just the current Russia. She's just the Soviet Union. But so any of these characters who are not loyal to the Soviet Union, Mother Russia will kill them like in a heartbeat. And she is by far the most powerful um villain of all of these various Russian characters, right? So she's even more powerful than Dr. Tunguska. And she's why Dr. Tunguska can't sort of just go do her own thing. Okay. Uh and then there's other heroes, well, heroes. The Soviet Union would call them heroes, the America would call them villains, But there's Perun, who is actually from the mythology of that region, and he is really their Thor, where he's a storm god with a hammer, and he's very, very Thor, but he's totally, Soviet. And then I don't know if I mentioned this already, but Black Widow is at this point in the timeline married to a character named the Russian Bear. And we mentioned him in the Golden Age adventures where Superman Red, we kind of mentioned ad nauseum on this channel. There were a bunch of him running around because of the split power, right? One of those guys ended up becoming the Russian Bear. Okay. So Black Widow, who has, she works for the Russian government and so on and so forth, she tells her husband what's going on, what's really going on with this supercomputer, right? And how it's going to lead to this big, thing with aliens and stuff. And it's very, very bad. And the Russian government is refusing to destroy it. And the Russian Bear is another one of these characters who he's kind of here because Black Widow's here. He's not here because he loves the government or how it works or what they're up to, right? So the Russian Bear decides to take one for the team and he destroys the Russian supercomputer. And then what happens is Mother Russia becomes aware of this. This was the other thing we did with Mother Russia was kind of a whole 1984 Big Brother is watching kind of a thing. So she's tied in almost like oh, how do I want to describe this? You know how the Borg, if one Borg sees a thing, then like all the Borg know about it, right? They have a hive mind. So Mother Russia kind of has that with anybody who's a Russian, but it's a one-way street, right? So the Russian citizens gain no awareness of anything, right? But she sees everything all of them see. So, which obviously makes the Russian setting in this era that much more oppressive by design. So at any rate, she becomes aware that the Russian Bear destroyed this computer. So she kills him just outright. She is way more powerful than he is. So she just obliterates him. And so then at that point, Black Widow is a literal widow. Um, okay. So let me think. Is there anything else? Um, I guess that's kind of it. That was about it for the A as Andromeda adventure, right? So then we get into sort of the idea of epilogue, which is also just kind of the greatest hits of other times the Fembots showed up and what we did with them. So in the United States, for instance, there was this guy named Dr. William Lauren, and he and his wife didn't have any kids. They wanted kids, but couldn't have them. And he worked for the government, so he had access to Fembot blueprints, right? So he decides to build a young Fembot. And by young, I mean, it's unclear. She's maybe 18. She's maybe early 20s, somewhere in that ballpark. But her name is Jaina Lauren, right? And sort of like how we see in the original Blade Runner movie, where replicants think they're human because they're given memories and stuff like that. That's exactly what Dr. Lauren does. Is this robot girl, Jaina, thinks she's human and she thinks she's his biological daughter, right? Um, and then Dr. Lauren also builds a handful of other robots to be servants, like butlers and maids and stuff like that. And by the way, this is all from an old Twilight episode, or excuse me, Twilight Zone episode. I believe it's episode 44. But Jaina is like irritated by the robots. The others don't think they're human. She's the only one who thinks she's human, right? She doesn't like robots, ironically, and shoves a maid down the stairs, right? And she feels trapped and she wants to sort of go out and do stuff, but the windows are always closed and she hasn't clued in yet as to sort of like what's really going on. And so she asks Dr. Lauren to dismantle the robots. And one of her arguments is like you're going to be too dependent on machines, and we don't want to be dependent on stuff. Um, we want to be like self-sufficient and so on and so forth. So Dr. Lauren actually orders the machines to like go down to the basement, wait for me to dismantle you. And the machines like sort of voice their objections to this, right? Because again, we're seeing sort of the dawn of free will, and it's dealing with a lot of the AI stuff going on in the world today. By the way, this Twilight Zone episode, I think, aired in 1959. Kudos to them for calling it. But at any rate, so the machines in the basement are kind of like, what did we do? How did we displease you? Um, Meanwhile, the daughter character, Jaina, starts to piece everything together. And she's like, why am I not in any of the photo albums? She mentions wanting to get married and have kids one day, and her mom's acting kind of weird about it. And she realizes she's a robot. And what's twisted is then the doctor is like, okay, well, that didn't work out, I guess. So he wipes her memory and they have her replace the maid that got shoved down the stairs. Um, so that's again, typical Twilight Zone ending, right? The next thing is, let's see, 1964. So there's this scientist named Dr. Carl Miller. He works for the United States Air Force. He builds a fembot called AF 709, which implies that the Air Force has 708 other fembots, right? But number 709, he takes to this psychiatrist friend of his named Dr. Bob McDonald. And he gives her to Bob so that he can educate her because she's naive, right? She's a sophisticated machine, but in terms of personality, she's naive, right? Just like Andromeda was. And again, just like in the Andromeda show, we see some really kind of messed up stuff from the protagonist of the series, where he tells her to quote unquote, you're going to be the quote unquote perfect woman, which he defines as a girl who, quote unquote, does what she's told and doesn't talk back. So again, we watch that now and it's like, wow, that's okay. Um, I'm personally, I'm just kind of always surprised by that sort of thing. Um, I don't want to go off on a big thing about it. God knows I've gone off on enough tangents already. But that's a 1964 TV series called oh, what is that one called? My Living Doll. Then in 1965, the next year, we get Dr. Goldfoot. And Dr. Goldfoot, by the way, was played by Vincent Price, who I love. And his thing that he does is he starts building fembots and he sends them to seduce and rob wealthy men. And by the way, this is worth mentioning, I feel like, in terms of how the fembots work. Uh, Again, they're the lovers of these millionaires and stuff, right? And the millionaires have no idea they're robots. So that tells you a little bit about their construction, right? So they're not cold to the touch. They're not there's no delicate way for me to put this. Again, it's kind of that thing I said earlier where if you look in their mouth, you're not going to see wires and stuff, right? So the same has to be true of every opening in the body, right? I'll leave it at that. Um, but I thought that was interesting that they can go to that extent and still nobody has any idea what they are. And now also we're seeing them become a little more sophisticated in terms of personality. And now they can manipulate people and things like that, right? So the fembots are actually getting more and more dangerous in all these appearances. Speaking which, in 1966, there are spies who are working for the government of China. They learn what Dr. Goldfoot is up to, right? And they force him to create um, a new kind of fembot that has a nuclear warhead in it so that they can get these girls to go to various countries. And this predates, by the way, sort of like metal detectors and those sorts of checkpoints. So in an era when they would just maybe frisk a person before they let them, board, whatever, a 747 or something, um, that's kind of a horrific thought. And this is how they're getting weapons into other people's countries, without those countries knowing. Um, and by the way, that one, the 1969 adventure, that was based on a movie called Dr. Goldfoot and the Girl Bombs. The one before it, which again, it's both in that series, with the Vincent Price character. That the first one was called Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machines. At any rate, so next up is, or I think I said 69 earlier and I shouldn't have. It was 65 is Bikini Machines, 66 is Girl Bombs. So 69, then I'm trying to remember the name of that movie. I can't remember the name of the movie now. I want to say it's called Some Girls Do. But at any rate, in that one, the criminal mastermind is a guy named Carl Peterson. And his army of fembots, who are also good at manipulation and all that other stuff, they are replacing stewardesses, which I thought was kind of interesting. And so their whole thing is the world's first supersonic airliner is called the SST-1. They sabotage it. And so they're causing things, they're causing crashes, right? And then he's making money off of this. So I thought that was also interesting. And then another thing we get there is they are acting kind of like a Black Widow spider or a female praying mantis or whatever, where the stewardesses will seduce various targets, right? And then while the guy is asleep, they kill him. Which I thought it was a very interesting idea. And then in the early 70s, we get the Stepford Wives. And I feel like a lot of people have heard about this one. For anyone who hasn't heard this, the story there is basically there's this woman named Joanna Eberhardt, and which interestingly enough is my grandma's maiden name. Not the Joanna part, but the Eberhardt part. At any rate, though, she's a uh photographer in New York City who apparently does very well for herself, and they decide, her and her husband, that is, they decide to move to Stepford, Connecticut. And um they notice that most of the women here are, and again, this is like a very kind of um it's all about feminism, right? So she is very, very feminist, and she's disturbed that the women of Stepford are like the opposite of that, basically, right? Where they all just want to be housewives. They kind of just want to be pretty for their husbands and stuff like that. And so Joanna's like really, really bothered by this. And she runs into a couple of other women who are kind of like she is, basically. They also think all this is weird. They become friends. And one by one, her friends start to act like the other women, where they just want to be a housewife, they just want to be pretty for their husband, so on and so forth, right? And um so it turns out what's really going on is there's like the local men's club, and one of the guys in the men's club is a Disney Imagineer. And I thought it was interesting that, and I can't remember when this came out. I want to say like 72 or something like that. Um, I mean, anybody can just Google it, find out. The early 70s, though, right? I was shocked that that early on, the author of the novel was um talking about how Disney works with the United States government. Like it's kind of had more traction in recent years, um, where people are starting to find out that, for instance, a lot of the like there are a lot of cases of SA that happen in Disney World or whatever it is in Florida, right? Disney World is Florida, right? Disneyland's California, I think. I always get those two mixed up. At any rate, the Florida resort, the Florida Disney place, there are a lot of crimes happen there. And people will go to this is real. I'm actually talking about real life here for a second. People will go to report these crimes, and they'll go to like they leave the park and they go to some little town in Florida where there's like a sheriff or something, and they tell him, right? And so there was this thing in the news recently where we found out some of those sheriffs and stuff are actually you're still in the park when you think you've left the park. And these guys are actually like corporate security for Disney, claiming to be um something else, right? And people, because there's a lawsuit I think that's still going on right now, and I'm doing a horrible job of explaining it, but people are finding out that like Disney was never allowed to buy the land. So I think it was the CIA bought the land for Disney, which raised the question of, well, what is Disney doing in return? And then people started talking about this is a conspiracy thing. I'm not saying if it's true or not, I just think it's either way, it's interesting. Like I personally don't believe in aliens, but I love watching shows like sightings about aliens, right? I think it's interesting. So on that level, the conspiracy is that Disney is actually building some kind of robots, that like you see the animatronics in the Hall of Presidents or whatever, and they're from like the 60s. So my long-winded point there is I just think it's interesting that in the Stepford Wives, the author is talking about this and seems to be concerned about Disney's ability to make robots. And so that's what's going on in the Stepford Wives. And in our game, we then tie it into all the other Fembot stories by saying because Disney does have connections to the CIA, which in real life bought all the land in Florida that all the Disney, park was built on. Because of that connection, therefore, Disney would know how to build fembots, and then we got into the idea that unlike in real life where they hire like a pretty college girl or something to be Snow White or Sleeping Beauty or whatever and walk around the park meeting kids and stuff, in our version, those are fembots, which I kind of liked the idea of that because there's the juxtaposition of how sweet the character they are playing seems to be, where it's cutesy fairy tale stuff. But then you temper that with, well, yes, but we've seen all these fembot assassins and weaponized and all that, you know what I mean? And so like that becomes creepy, which I kind of like to do creepy stuff in my game. Um, and then the last one I will mention is just then famously, perhaps most famously of all, the fembots then show up as recurring villains on the $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman TV shows, which I loved both of those things when I was a kid. I spent a ton of time watching that stuff. I was one of those kids that would run around. But me and all the other kids too that I went to school with. It wasn't just me. Like we would do this thing where after school they would like have us walk from the school to this church, and it was sort of like a free daycare thing for the community in a way, so that then when your mom would get off work at 5 o'clock or whatever, she'd go to the church to pick you up, take you home, blah blah blah. But at any rate, I remember me and all these other boys running around the yard of the church in slow motion, making the $6 Million Man sound. That's neither here nor there. See, this is why I usually type this stuff up I read a script so that you're not listening to me ramble on about how the CIA built Disney World or how we used to play $6 Million Man as a kid. So I'll wrap this up. At any rate, I thought the whole Fembot thing was very, very interesting. Um, I think I mentioned it before, but in case I forgot, I will mention it now. When I watched Austin Powers, I thought the Fembots were cool, but I didn't really get it. I'd kind of forgotten ever seeing fembots in anything. Like I guess when the faces come off, and that's sort of like the 70s sci-fi TV show cliche, is there's a character whose face comes off. I can't remember the guy's name. I just watched an episode of the $6 Million Man, and it was the dad from the original Nightmare on Elm Street. He was on $6 Million Man as like a male version of what we've been talking about. And so like his face falls off at one point and you see like the inside of the head. And I remember as a kid thinking that was like super interesting. I was really into that. They also do it, by the way, I just remembered on the old Linda Carter Wonder Woman show. They have at least twice that I can think of. At one point, she's fighting a guy with a fencing flail and she hits his face or something and his face comes off and he's got that ovular hole in his face. And that was a robotic duplicate of the villain in that episode. And just like in the earlier thing I mentioned, this one had a bomb inside of it. And I think she throws it into a mine shaft or something and it goes off in there. And I want to say it was nuclear, but I can't remember now. But that's one instance. And then there's another one, which weirdly enough is the Christmas episode that seems to have the Riddler in it. Frank Gorshin, who I met, by the way, super nice guy. He played the Riddler on Batman 66, and he's in this episode of Wonder Woman where he's doing a lot of toy stuff, but he plays the character the way he plays the Riddler, which I know a lot of fans who kind of want that to be the Riddler, and he was just operating under an assumed name or whatever because he was in this other town and blah blah blah. But point being, he makes a fembot copy of Wonder Woman, who, if I remember correctly, is as strong as Wonder Woman is, and so on and so forth, right? And so Wonder Woman fights her, and that's like their Christmas special, is the Wonder Woman versus Wonder Woman cat fight. It's kind of cool. And it happens in I want to say a toy. Well, see, I think there's a toy store above, and then they have like a gigantic basement that is kind of like a toy factory. And he's been doing stuff like making exploding remote controlled cars or something to harass politicians and whatever. But at any rate, it's a cool episode. But yeah, I can't believe I overlooked that. That would be another fembot. But yeah, so fembots were like everywhere way back then, right? And a lot of that stuff, I would see it when I was a little kid and I'd kind of forget about it. And so by the time I saw Austin Powers, like when was that? Like 1999 or something, 98, I don't know. But when Austin Powers hit, I thought the fembots were cool, and when the face would come off, like it looked familiar to me, but I wasn't quite placing it. And I had to kind of be watching other shows like The Bionic Man and then see a fembot and be like, oh, I guess this is what Austin Powers is talking about. Or I had to, for instance, be researching something like the Stepford Cuckoos to jog my memory on what was going on with the Stepford Wives to be like, oh, okay, here they are again. But yeah, I didn't even mention every appearance of them in pop culture, but there's a lot, right? Like it was a thing for sure for like a long time. And by the way, it doesn't stop in the 70s. In the 80s, I won't go there, but there were like a bunch of movies about like robot girlfriends and stuff in the 80s. I feel like you could argue that's what Weird Science kind of was in a way, but it gets weirder because of how they made it. Again, tangents. I'll stop going off on tangents. The point is, um, I think the fembot phenomenon is really interesting. And I feel like it's a little more relevant in a way now with what's going on with AI now. Uh, like I know a lot of people who are using these AI chat websites and kind of have like an AI girlfriend. And and there's some creepy stuff that some people are doing. Not everybody, of course, obviously, but some people I know are kind of like, for instance, they'll play role-playing games using AI, and then they will cancel coming over to my house to play the game because they would rather stay home and talk to their AI girlfriend. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think a lot of the old Fembot stuff from the 60s, going all the way back to Twilight Zone in 1959. I mean, honestly, even before that, shout out right to Maria from Fritz Lang's Metropolis. I was researching robots in just in fiction, period, in like classical literature in the I can't remember if it was 1800s or 1700s. There were like multiple novels written about a fembot named Olympia. And I don't know why that was the name they chose. And I don't know if somebody else saw the first novel and then they were just writing a different story, but they would reuse the name Olympia. But like the idea of a sort of like an almost steampunk fembot shows up a bunch. And again, you can't tell she's a robot. In some of those stories, it'd be like a guy marries a girl and they would just say stuff like she has no emotions, like she's beautiful but emotionless, or she's cold to the touch. And then everybody else is like, oh, she must have some disease, or you know what I mean? I mean, really going, I guess we could take it all the way back to the idea of the golem, right? I remember reading a story one time, I can't remember what it was called. Ironwood, maybe? But it was the idea is there's this golem, and then in this version it's all magic. But they make like a female golem, and then they cast a spell so that it doesn't weigh so much. So it can like swim in water and stuff without sinking. They cast a spell that's like the illusion of the appearance of a woman. But like everything about it is a spell. And again, you get into this idea, even though now we're talking about like a medieval setting or whatever, you get into this idea that you can't tell she's not a human, you know? So it's weird that it seems like this idea has just always been with us. You know what I mean? I should probably also mention Galatea, right? The story of Pygmalion. Kind of the same idea, right? So it's very interesting to me, but then it's also interesting that um it seems like it just really exploded in the 60s. And I'm wondering if that was like the way people were thinking about the A bomb and like the space race. Was it sort of like, was technology now at the forefront of people's lives? It's sometimes kind of hard to quite put your finger on it when you weren't alive then, you know what I mean? Um, but I'm wondering if it's sort of like the association with completely unrelated technology just got people thinking more about the idea of robot girlfriends. Or I mean, I suppose because in the 50s you get the first um the big computers that take up whole rooms, right? So maybe I should be looking at it from that point of view because that's a little more apples to apples, but I don't know. Whatever the reason is, it's just very interesting to me that in the 60s, you know, all these things were predicting it. And there were Twilight episode or Twilight Zone rather episodes set in the future. There's one about a guy on an asteroid who was given a fembot, and the asteroid is a prison. And I guess he's there, and he's actually an innocent man who's been jailed anyways. And the guy who brings him his supplies feels bad for him. So on one of the supply runs, he brings him a fembot. And at the end, the prisoner's sentence is up, and it's like, okay, but you're leaving on this kind of space shuttle thing with all these other prisoners. It's basically a bus, right? It's like a space bus. And you can only bring, and I forget what they said, 5 pounds of stuff with you or something when you leave. And when he realizes he can't leave without the girl, who again seems just like a human girl, blah, 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 has emotions, has become self-aware, is acting in a heroic manner. He decides to stay, that he'd rather be on this remote asteroid with her than to be quote unquote free without her. Star Trek has a ton of fembots in it, but again, it was made in the 60s, right? So it's interesting that the 60s is when all this exploded. At any rate, I said I was going to stop going off on tangents. This has been way longer than it probably should have been. I apologize for that. Um, at any rate, I hope that you found some of this to be interesting. As always, thank you guys so much for being here. I know there's a million other things you could be doing than listen to me prattle on about whatever I'm on about in this particular video. Um, before you leave, if you'd be willing to do me a favor, I'd really appreciate it. If you hit like, make sure you're still subscribed, ring the bell, and leave a comment. And as for the comment section, did I miss anything? If I left something out that you think is relevant, by all means, let me know. If I got a date wrong or something like that, let me know, that kind of thing. I'm only human, and especially when I don't write this stuff out, I tend to maybe get the wrong name for the movie, or I get the date wrong. I know that one. I said one of those Dr. Goldfoot things was 1969, and that was not. I was thinking of the stewardess thing. That was 69. But at any rate, I hope you enjoyed this one. And as always, from everybody here at the longest running superhero RPG on Earth, we hope you guys have a great week, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.